As people know that have followed this event for the past 2 years, a major issue in sports, major issue in life, major issue in all of youth and professional sports has been head trauma and head injuries. We are nearing the end, as we'll talk about in a second, of the complex and massive litigation against the NFL based on concussion and thousands of plaintiffs being settled. The co-lead counsel for the plaintiffs group is distinguished alumnus Saul Weiss. Welcome.
Thanks, Andy.
We are nearing the end.
We're near the end.
We were here 2 years ago, and it was in the process of being settled. It is still in that process. Take us quickly through where we've been, where we're going. We have had a preliminary approval, and there have been some changes requested, changes asked for. Are we nearing the finish line?
We are. We had a hearing in November in which the NFL and the players who support the settlement put on a lot of evidence, both scientific and... Is it on?
Now it is.
Okay, thanks.
Now it is.
Scientific and otherwise. Before Judge Brody, it was a full day's procedure. And we've been waiting now for the judge to take in all that she saw and read all the briefs that have been given to her. And we're confident that very shortly we'll hear from her and we'll be at final approval.
Very shortly. Any guesstimates?
I really can't. It's April. All the post-hearing briefs have been filed. I'm happy to report that every week, one or two players who initially opted out have revoked their opt-outs. We only had about 200 to start, and we're below that number. And that shows that overwhelming support by the 19,000 plus retired players for the deal.
In simplest terms, I know it's been such a complex case, but every retired NFL player is swept into this, whether they filed a lawsuit or not, correct?
Correct. It's a class action, so that if you didn't object or opt out, you're part of the class. There were, I guess, in collection, a couple hundred people who objected. A lot of those objections were dealt with by amendments to the settlement after the hearing. As I said, there were maybe 210 or so people who chose to opt out of the deal and continue in court. That number's below 200 and dropping every day.
And opt-outs, to be clear, can now sue the NFL on their own.
Correct.
Otherwise, if they're in the settlement, they waive that right.
If you're in the settlement, you abide by the terms of the settlement, which are pretty generous.
Respond to the critics that say it's not enough. The NFL makes, as David just said, $12, $13 billion a year. This is less than $1 billion, although there is no cap.
There's no cap on the amount of compensation, and we lifted the cap on how much it will cost to do baseline assessment. So there really isn't any cap, and if people qualify, players qualify, they're going to get paid, and there's no limitation. So it's a good thing. And the fact that the NFL may make $13 billion or $9 billion, whatever they make, is irrelevant. This was a difficult litigation, cutting edge, a lot of legal defenses the NFL had. They could take years and years and years of hard-fought litigation with a very unhappy result at the end. So it's a deal that both sides do well on.
What have you learned being in this litigation, representing players of all types, players that were star players, players not having issues, and of course someone like a Kevin Turner stricken with ALS who has serious issues?
I want to say one thing about Kevin. He's an unusual and a great human being, and to see his decline is very troubling and very sad. I'm glad he's still with us, and I hope we can get final approval, and so he and his family can enjoy the benefits of what he'll get, which is $5 million.
And the $5 million is ALS. It's all according to a grid of how long they played and when they were suffering.
and how old they were at the time of diagnosis, correct.
And how about the critics that say no inclusions for CTE?
There was a lot of discussion at the fairness hearing about that issue. It's still not recognized as a diagnosis in living players by a majority of doctors and scientists. The settlement terms and the compensation that's covered for neurocognitive benefits really includes most people who, quote, have CTE in stage 3 and stage 4. So it is covered.
Covered through dementia and other maladies?
That's correct. Dementia and early onset Alzheimer's disease.
It's according to a grid, as you just mentioned.
Yes.
Is there, and this is a very tough question, guy plays 3 years, some fogginess at age 45. I mean, are there recoveries that players can look forward to without knowing exactly what they may face down the road?
I'll put it this way. There are objective neuropsychological tests that are widely recognized as being appropriate and determinative of neurocognitive deficits and disabilities. And it's a progressive problem, and as players age, some of them are going to fall into the category of having these problems. And whether they've had a concussion, 1, 2, 3, or none in the NFL, they're going to get paid.
Will they go before, for lack of a better phrase, a medical tribunal to
Nope.
see what their injuries are? How will they be assessed?
They're going to be tested. We're going to have qualified neuropsychologists and neurologists throughout the country. They're independently retained. They're not retained by the NFL. And there's objective tests that the court will approve in final approval. And they'll be given to every player the same manner, the same way. And based upon their scoring, depending how low they become, and it's called the standard deviation, below norm, that's how they'll qualify for a payment.
What changes have you seen since you've got involved in this? Do you see less young people playing contact sports? Would you suggest, I know you're not an athletic coach, but would you suggest less young people playing contact sports?
I see athletes being more aware of potential risks from closed head injuries, and they take time off when it happens. They recover and they go back and play. It's a good thing. And yes, I suspect maybe a fewer number of athletes will choose to play football than in the past. It's still a great game, and it can be played much safer.
And speaking of that, excuse me. Speaking of that, we have our NCAA panel coming up next. You see trickle down with either litigation or changes made based on this litigation at the lower levels, NCAA, high school.
There are changes. I work out with a trainer who is at the Haverford School, and we talk all the time about the changes at the high school level, not just in football, soccer, lacrosse, hockey, basketball. They look for signs when athletes look dazed. They look for signs when athletes get hit hard and don't seem right. They test them on the field, and they take them out of the game, and then they go see doctors. It's a good thing.
And I have to ask about something, we covered in media in terms of this recent retirement. For those who don't know, Chris Borland, San Francisco 49ers, played 1 year, just 1 year. Good player, ascending young player with a lot of talent, and chose to retire. I think it's a moment, preemptive retirement, asymptomatic. When you look at that, you see more of that coming? Your reaction having represented all these players?
I don't know, but if you read newspapers, watch television, there's a whole bunch of athletes and athletes' parents who say, if I had known then what I know now, I wouldn't let my kid play, or I wouldn't play football. Was it Kurt Warner has made that statement?
Barack Obama?
There are others. So what we tried to do was to make the public aware and people aware about how dangerous head injuries can be long term. And I think we're successful in that regard, and now the public is aware.
If there was one thing you could advise, whether it's Roger Goodell, NCAA football, high school football, how to make a violent game safer, what would you say, having been in this a couple of years?
I think the league's done a good job. There's less focus on violent hits. I think this year they've got an independent neurologist on the sidelines, and if the neurologist sees an issue, they're going to step in and prevent the player from coming back onto the field.
Yeah, we should note that they just passed a rule, the NFL did, where now independent trainers can stop the game. We can have a medical timeout, first time. So that'll go into effect the coming season.
Take a look at soccer. Look at the changes in soccer, especially in women's soccer. Far less girls are heading soccer balls. I remember seeing, I guess a couple years ago, Cantu did a presentation either on Dateline or one of those programs in which she had a bunch of 15 and 16-year-old girls could only study in darkness because of the significant problems they had from heading balls. It's, like I said, it's an awakening. It came at the right time. The NFL did the right thing. And I'm also surprised at the number of players who stepped forward. That's really heartening because it used to be that players had to keep their mouths shut. If you were hurt and you didn't want to get back into the game, there was someone else that get in and you lost your job. That mentality's changed a little bit.
Yeah, Chris Borland could be a sign of that.
That is a sign. And he was able to make a decision based on all that he knows, which information he wouldn't have had 4 or 5 years ago, about whether it was worth it for him to continue to play that sport.
If and when it settles, and you would think when, soon, when do the players receive their checks?
Well, we have to deal with some objectors. I think most of the objectors will go away. If some stay around and push the case to the Third Circuit, the players won't get paid until the Third Circuit rules, and that could prolong it 6-9 months, which I hope doesn't happen. But assuming there is no real objection, I would think within 4 or 5 months of final approval, some of the players who have all their medical stuff together and qualify will start to get checks.
We'll hope for that.
I'm looking forward to that because I know a lot of families that I've met over the years who really need this assistance. There are a lot of retired players who can't work. There are a lot of retired players who have severe financial problems because they can't care for their families. And they deserve to get paid, and their families need to move on.
Are we going to continue to see these heartfelt stories that are not getting the money they think they should get?
Probably. It's a fair deal. It's quite a lot of money. There are risks in every litigation, and I can't assure a player that if you had opted out and you went to a jury, you would get compensated, and more More importantly, I'm not sure you'd ever get past preemption or some of the other defenses that the NFL has. It's a compromise, and hopefully it's changed the game a little bit, not just in the pros, high school, college. And that's an important aspect of litigation and why I'm proud to be a litigator.
Where do you see football 10, 15, 20 years?
I don't know. In the next 10 years, I think you'll see prosperity in NFL. It's still a fun thing to watch. The stadiums are filled. The college game is still robust, although there'll be some changes. And Friday nights, in a lot of places in America, high school football is king. I don't see that changing so quickly.
No shortages of mothers not letting their kids play football trickling up.
We will hear some of that, I'm sure. It doesn't mean it's the end of the sport, though.
Saul Weiss, thanks so much.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much for having me back.